Friends, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you from whichever part of the world you are joining us today for this conversation. I am Vishal Gupta, chairperson of the Ashank Desai Centre for Leadership and Organisation Development at the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. On behalf of the team at the Ashank Desai Centre, and my fellow colleague, Professor Asha Kaul, I welcome you all to the next edition of Leadership Conversation. Leadership Conversation series hosts individuals who have spent their life experiencing and demonstrating leadership or researching on various facets of leadership. This conversation series is a platform through which we aim to raise consciousness about critical topics related to leadership and organization development. We believe these efforts will help inform and develop possible solutions to the leadership problems that our world is facing today. It is a great honor and privilege to host our esteemed guest, Professor Joseph Badaracco, in this edition of Leadership Conversation. The title of today's conversation is Leadership Conundrums When Achilles Meets Krishna, where we will talk to Professor Badaracco on how one traverses through the conundrum and proves oneself worthy of leadership. Before we get started, let me introduce Professor Badaracco. Well, we will address him as Joe in this conversation because the aim is we will like to keep this as informal as we can. Joseph Badaracco is the John Shad Professor of Business Ethics at Harvard Business School. He has taught courses on business ethics, strategy and management in the school's MBA and executive programs. Joe is a graduate of St. Louis University, Oxford University, where he was a Rhodes Scholar, and Harvard Business School, where he earned an MBA and a DBA. In recent years, Joe served as chair of the MBA program and as housemaster of Career House in Harvard College. He has also been chairman of the Harvard University Advisory Committee on Shareholder Responsibility and has served on the boards of 2 public companies. Joe has taught in executive programs in the United States, Japan, and many other countries and has spoken to a wide variety of organizations on issues of leadership, values, and ethics. He is also the faculty chair of the Nomura School of Advanced Management in Tokyo. Joe's current research focuses on what counts as sound reflection for busy men and women who have serious responsibilities and face hard practical problems. He has written many books on leadership, decision-making, and responsibility. These include Defining Moments, When Managers Must Choose Between Right and Right, Leading Quietly, An Orthodox Guide to Doing the Right Thing, Questions of Character, and The Good Struggle, Responsible Leadership in an Unforgiving World. As scholars, as PhD student, I can tell you I read books by Joe as I was doing my research on leadership, and his research, his writings have really influenced the way I think today about leadership. And I'm sure many of us have had experience of either listening or maybe reading his works before. So it is a great pleasure to have with us for this conversation, Joe. And without further ado, I would like to invite Joe to share his opening remarks on this important question or title that we have for today, Leadership Conundrums, and how do leaders engage with these. Joe, welcome, and your remarks, please.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And it's good to meet all of you who are out there wherever you are. Let me just start by mentioning one thing about the background, which you will see behind me, One of the themes of our conversation today will be ethics and responsibility in its many forms. And the background behind me, I have to tell you, is completely false. The only exception is the tall building, the tower. That is the library at Harvard Business School. But there are no leaves on any of the trees. And unlike you, we are expecting 8 to 10 inches of snow in the next day or so. So don't think I'm over here in some form of luxurious semi-tropical paradise. So let me turn now directly to the topic we're going to be discussing today, which is a difficult topic to put a label on. So Vishal has referred to conundrums. And in writing that he and Asha have done, they've referred to leadership paradoxes. The language I've tended to use is dilemmas, and part of what we're doing today is making a kind of very tentative East-West comparison. That's implicit in the Krishna, Achilles sort of comparison. And at different times, I think all of us will try to highlight differences between what you might call an Eastern or Western perspective. That said, there have been so many different ways in which the East and West have combined and learn from each other that we shouldn't exaggerate the differences either. And I think you'll actually see some surprising convergences and some powerful themes that cut across very different sorts of traditions. Let me tell you a little bit about the perspective I'm going to bring to this discussion, and a perspective that I've been bringing to my work for a couple decades now. And I want to do that by describing an unusual course that I teach at Harvard Business School, and in particular, the ideas for the course. I don't think you're that interested in learning about the mechanics or the curriculum, but the ideas really are, I think, an important place for us to start. So a typical Harvard Business School course is 80 minutes long. There are 90 students in a horseshoe-shaped classroom. The preparation is reading a case study, which is a description of a manager who's dealing with a problem. There's 2 questions for discussion. What's the problem and what would you do about the problem? The instructor basically orchestrates the discussion rather than giving a lecture. That's our standard teaching methodology. What I do in this course is significantly different. It's taught in the 2nd year, so it's an elective course. I will have 70 or 80 students, once again in a horseshoe classroom. But at that point, the differences disappear. My classes last for 2 hours. Instead of traditional case studies, students read works of serious literature for most of the classes. I literally sit on a desk in front of the room. I don't walk around. I don't cold call. And I don't write on the board. I want to make this as much as possible the students' discussion. And the reason we do it this way, particularly the reason we use serious literature, is because, as I see it, great literature is really the best type of case study you can work with. A typical Harvard Business School case study, and some of you have probably seen them, describes a manager who might be a marketing executive staring out a window, and you might learn 2 or 3 facts about his career, and then you fill in the rest with your own assumptions and prejudices about marketing people or manufacturing people. Literature takes you inside the mind, inside the spirit of the protagonists, and it makes it a uniquely powerful way to understand leadership. And it also elicits reactions from students of a more personal nature. They react personally to the protagonists, to the characters in the stories. They're more open, and in turn, other students are more open. You have a very different quality of discussion, a very different feel of discussion. That said, the course is not a literature course. It's a Harvard Business School course. It has a framework. So let me tell you a bit about the framework. We have 15 sessions. The basic idea is that when you face a hard problem and you have to make a decision, there's a lot of uncertainty, the pressure's on you. There's 3 important ways to think about it. One is in terms of accountability. Who are you accountable to and for what? And in the first 5 or 6 classes, we look at different works of literature and talk about accountability as a human being, accountability in a role. Role could be business executive, doctor, lawyer, parent. We talk about accountability in close relationships, family and friends. Are those different forms of accountability than accountability to strangers? We talk about accountability to God, religion broadly defined, and accountability to yourself, which is a peculiar perspective on ethics, but it's an important one. So the first part of the course says we have complex accountability. If you have a hard decision, figure out who you're accountable to, figure out what you were accountable for doing, and then do it. And that sounds simple if you phrase it the way I just phrased it, but you've already begun to see the problem, and you can call it a conundrum or a dilemma or a paradox. Accountability often pulls us in different directions. So how do we decide among these different responsibilities or sources of accountability? The answer is partly the second part of the course, where we look at character, the evolution of character, what counts as virtue. There are 3 background readings for this part of the course, some from Nietzsche, the contemporary perspective, some from Aristotle, and some from Confucius. And we use that as background for understanding the evolution of character, the role of character in making these decisions, the role of character in developing judgment. And then the final part of the course says, that's all wonderful. You should think about accountability. You should think about character. But if you have a position of real responsibility in life or at work, you've got to make a decision, and then you've got to execute. You've got to act. You've got to have a plan that's going to make a difference. And so the last part of the course asks what is pragmatic, what will work. And we start there by reading The Prince from Machiavelli, which I suspect most of you have heard of and may even know about. He's sort of the ultimate pragmatist. So that's the approach I take through literature, through lengthy discussions, with a framework to understanding how to make these difficult decisions. Let me close this introduction by emphasizing one other theme that runs through the course. And that's the challenge of leadership. I wrote a book with the title, The Good Struggle, several years ago. And leadership in many ways is a struggle. And what the course brings out are several struggles. First, the complexity of problems. It's a funny principle of organizations that easy problems, standard problems, familiar problems get delegated downwards to people who can handle them and have the relevant background and special training. The really hard problems get delegated up to the top levels of an organization. These are the messy, indeterminate, uncertain problems, the gray area problems. And a lot of what senior people do is deal with the gray. And senior might be senior in a department, it might be in part of an organization, it might be at the CEO level. But gray area problems get delegated to the top. They are the most complex ones. Secondly, these problems are challenging because morality is challenging and complex. A lot of people believe or want to believe that morality can be reduced to a couple single precepts, or maybe a single one. You know, in the Western tradition from the Bible, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. One of the underlying themes of this course is morality is complex. Character is complex. We are complex. Accountability is complex. And getting things done in the world is challenging. So that's the second reason, the complexity of morality. And then the final problem is one I've just touched on. The final challenge is the complexity of ourselves. And as you look through the individuals, the characters in the stories we discuss, you don't find any heroes, you don't find any saints. These are human beings who not only struggle, but sometimes get confused, sometimes are vulnerable, sometimes fail. It's not that they simply have an Achilles heel, or that we simply have an Achilles heel, a small spot of vulnerability. It's more like having an Achilles leg or an Achilles torso. We're fallible human beings. And that's another challenge for leadership, which is to overcome your own limitations and vulnerabilities, see the complexity of morality, understand your accountability, and then decide what you're going to do and decide what you think is likely to work, and then get on with doing it. So that's kind of an overview of how I've been seeing the world and presenting the world, or a little part of the world, to my students over the last couple decades. But I'm looking forward to hearing thoughts from others on that.
So, Joe, that is a brilliant start to this entire seminar. I have a question, if I may. Joe, when we talk about leadership, we normally talk about models. So we say there's a model for transformational leadership. We say there's a model for charismatic leaders. So what happens is the students start evolving basis those models, those frameworks that have been provided. But listening to you and whatever we've been doing in similar courses over here at IIMA, there is no one framework that can be applied to different codes of morality. There's no one framework that could be applied for accountability. So at the time when you take the course, the class, there are multiple perspectives that come to the mind. So are we saying then that all the frameworks that have been suggested by researchers in this area in the domain of leadership, in today's world, when we're taking a look at complex issues, complex ways of handling situations, all these models come to naught? Because now we need to evolve and we need to come up with something which is totally different.
Yes, well, if you look back, say over the last couple decades, and I suspect many of the people listening can do this based on their own experience, you can think of a series of best-selling management books, each of which had a leadership model in it. And they come and go. And so it's easy to dismiss them. I think that's a bad mistake. I think the leadership models that come and go and that reach the top of bestseller lists and spawn academic articles often take one important facet of contemporary management or contemporary challenges and look at it in depth. So 20 years ago, this notion of a global leader was quite important. Right now in the United States, the phrase inclusive leadership, it gets a lot of attention. Inclusive leadership refers to recruiting a wide range of people in your organization and then making sure they feel included, they feel comfortable, they feel they are really participating with their whole selves. My guess is that in 5 years, nobody will be talking about inclusive leadership. But each of these temporary lenses, I think, is a way of looking at contemporary issues and seeing something you should think about and think about doing. That said, the framework that I put forward in my course is not my framework. I think that the fundamental ideas for thinking about leadership, deciding what's right, thinking about how well or badly you're doing, these have been around for millennia. They reflect a convergence of the most brilliant minds of all kinds trying to understand these great issues, as well as the experience of ordinary people who also struggle with these issues. And so I like to think that the frameworks that come from literature, serious literature, classic literature, are a more fundamental and enduring type of framework or perspective that everyone should have in the back of their mind most of the time. So I like the contemporary shifting passing models, but I like the enduring ones as well.
Joe, it is interesting that you emphasize and you talk about the importance of literature, and as they provide us enduring detailed case studies to analyze leadership. Interestingly, we at IIMA, we have also done some work around Mahabharata, one of the biggest and the largest and the most popular Indian epic. in these literatures, we often find situations where leaders are caught and they have to now decide whether uh, the deviation from the morals or the ethics is okay or not. So my question to you is, with your vast experience of looking at these areas of in literature, looking at these imperfect situations, how does one decide whether a situation that is in front of the leader is a situation where one should go by values and play right, or maybe deviate from the right to resolve the conundrum, the dilemma, the paradox that is there in front of us? Very seldom our lives are straight. They present to us dilemmas. So, what is your view on those situations, characteristics of those situations which are problematic?
Well, I've already described how I see the basic characteristics: complex accountability, more personal issues of character, and pragmatic considerations of what will work. But as you asked your question, Vishal, you were pointing directly towards a famous perspective that I'm sure you and Asha are familiar with. I suspect many of the people listening aren't. So I want to put it in front of everybody. It's called the dirty hands problem. And it's a situation where you've got to choose between one right thing and another right thing, or sometimes try to find the lesser wrong thing. But after you make that choice, you will still have some regrets because you might have done what you thought was the stronger right, but you failed in some other ways. There's a famous passage, it really dramatizes this. It's from a play called Dirty Hands by Jean-Paul Sartre, the French existentialist philosopher of the early post-war era. In the play, there are three characters. There's an older man who has led a cell of the Communist Party in France, in Paris, during the German occupation of World War II. So he's been working in hiding and in secrecy. He doesn't want to be discovered by the Germans. There's a young man who has just joined the party, and he's full of idealism and fervor and zeal. And then there's a woman and there's kind of a romantic rivalry over her. But the real rivalry is between the two men over the older man's stewardships, the decisions he's made to keep this little organization. He's an organizational leader, to keep this little organization alive. And at the climactic moment of the play, the young man accuses the older man of selling out. And the older man replies along the following lines. I think I've got the quote almost exactly. "How you cling to your purity, young man. How afraid you are to soil your hands. All right, stay pure. What good will it do you? Purity is an idea for a yogi or a monk, for someone standing on the sidelines wearing white gloves." He goes on to say, "Well, I have dirty hands. I have plunged them in filth and blood. But what do you think? Do you think you can govern innocently?" And I really like that last question. Do you think you can govern innocently? That is, do you think you can have real responsibility in life? And I don't mean just in a business, anywhere in life, and not have to deal with the kind of hard problems you described, Vishal, where I've got to make a decision. My answer to your question is fundamentally, you decide. You decide what's right. You decide what matters. You decide what's right. And you decide what works. Let me just say a little bit more about that. If you look at any complex situation, different people, say in a senior management team, will often disagree with each other about what's really important in that situation. Do we look at these numbers or those numbers? Do we look at this incident or that incident to get a sense of the corporate culture? If you look at disagreements in any group and in a senior management team, you'll find differences about the relevant moral principles. Now, everybody will agree we ought to follow the organization's values, but people apply and interpret them in different ways. And you'll have disagreements about practical-minded people about what's going to work. If you are the person responsible for making the decision, my advice is you pause, you find a little quiet time, you decide what, as you see it, really matters, what, as you see it, is decisively moral, and what, as you see it, will work. You put that together in a kind of intuitive way, and you say, this is right, this is what we're going to do. Now, you've got to be able to explain it to yourself, and you have to be able to explain it persuasively to others. But essentially, you decide what's right. You take responsibility as best you can, and you decide what you're going to do. So the answer to how do you finally decide is you decide, but it's after thinking through what matters, what's moral, and what's workable. So let me stop there, see what some reactions are to that basic notion. You decide by deciding.
I have a question, Joe. So when we say that you decide, so everyone, suppose there are 5 members in a leadership team, everyone decides their own way. Maybe they've thought through it. Maybe they're going ahead in a particular way, and everyone has a different approach. How do they come to a consensus? This takes us to what Nietzsche said, this is my way, what is yours? Yes. And we just carry on with the debate and the discussion. So it's not really group leadership. Whenever we talk about leadership, it is, taking other people along with you. But this becomes my personal leadership. To what value can we really take this kind of leadership? Then it's not leadership. It's just being adamant on the position that you would like to take. Everyone is adamant. What happens to the organization?
Well, as I think about it, I think in terms of 2 phases. Phase 1 is trying to understand the problem, what matters, what our responsibilities are, what's practical. And you want to have the right people in the room or around the table, people with relevant expertise, good judgment. You want good data. Sometimes you want big data, whatever that is. And then you need to have an honest, open conversation. And I think everybody listening understands this in principle. That's the right way to do phase 1, to really grapple with the problem and understand what it is. Sometimes a consensus will emerge. It might not be 100% consensus. It might be 80 or 90%, and the dissenters will say, okay, I understand the other perspective. We've got to move on. Let's go ahead with what the majority wants. You've got a decision then. Sometimes there really is no decision, no consensus that emerges. And then if you're responsible for the organization, you do have to decide. And as I mentioned a moment ago, you have to be able to explain your decision up to a point. Ideally, you can do it persuasively, and you can do it personally and authentically. But then the third phase is we all get on with doing it. And there will sometimes be people who dissent, they're unhappy, they would have done it differently. At some point, they may need to look for another organization if this happens too often or on bigger issues. But in a good organization, people respect each other and understand that someone has to make a final decision, and they'll support that final decision. Let me illustrate this with a little story. I came across this a number of years ago, and it stuck in my mind. It's not set in it's sort of vaguely set in some Eastern Hemisphere country. So a young man goes up to a famous guru or wise man and says, what holds up the earth? And the wise man reflects for a while, and he says to the young man, well, the earth is held up by a very, very strong man, an enormous man. And the young man says, thank you, and he goes away and thinks about this for a while. And he comes back and he says, oh, master, could you tell me what supports this very strong man? And the wise man says, well, the man stands on the shoulders of an immense and powerful eagle. And the young man says, thank you very much, goes away and thinks. He comes back again. And you can see that the story can go on and on and on. He comes back again and he says, oh, wise man, thank you so much for your answers, but I must ask you, what holds up the immense eagle? And the wise man looks up at the sky and thinks and says, the eagle stands on the shell of a very large turtle. This time the young man doesn't leave. He stays and he says, could you just tell me what holds up the turtle? And the wise man replies, look, kid, from here, it's turtles all the way down. So there comes a time when the dialogue has to end, the thoughtful responses have to end, and someone has to decide. And I think no one knows how people finally decide. I don't think cognitive neuroscience tells us what happens in the final moment when this almost quasi-aesthetic judgment is made that I think this is right. I think this is really important. This is what our responsibility is. This is going to work. That comes together in the mind of a leader, even having heard lots of back and forth, lots of different views. It comes together, and from that point, it is sort of turtles all the way down, and let's get on with the work. So that's my view of how these decisions are made and should be made. But maybe I went on too long, and we should, I'd like to hear your reactions.
So, Joe, when you talk about leaders have to decide and have to take an action considering all these complexities that we're talking about, at some time, at some moment, there is also a question that comes up, which is when you decide you want to do something, there are problematic means to do that, which is I want to, okay, I decide as a leader and I want to do something. I have thought about it, but the ways or means that I adopt to actually get that work done are problematic. And when my people in the organizations, in my organization or otherwise, they look at me, then there is a problem there as well. So there is also a question that often comes up. If I have to achieve something, how much and how far should I deviate in order to actually achieve what I have decided to achieve? So what are your thoughts on that conundrum that a leader faces, which is ways as well as the ends that you want to achieve?
Yes, I think I have two basic perspectives on that. The first is fairly simple. Find out what the law is and do your very best to follow the letter and the spirit of the law, and to make sure that the people you're working with and the people who are going to execute your decision follow the letter and the spirit of the law. Now, we could go into some challenges along those lines, but if as a leader you set an example of playing games with law and regulation, you're setting an example for other people in your organization. They're going to do something similar. They may not do it as carefully. They may not do it as thoughtfully. You may not even know they're doing it. And your company may end up in the newspaper, online, in front of regulators with all sorts of problems. So I know that there's lots of parts of the world where legal compliance is uncertain and difficult, and we can come back to that. But I think as you think about a plan of action going forward, your first, second, and third choice should be in compliance with the letter and spirit of the law and staying out of gray areas, okay? Because you don't want to set the wrong example. But within that, there can be really difficult ethical issues. And here I come back to the fact that morality, as I see it, is multiple, it's plural, and it's complex. So some people like to believe that we have at least a few basic fundamental moral principles that are universal. They're always true, like don't tell a lie, okay? But there's two problems with this universal principle of don't tell a lie. Sometimes the consequences of telling the truth are disastrous. The famous example in the Western tradition in the last 70 years has been you're a family in the Netherlands hiding a Jewish family and the Nazis have occupied your country. The Gestapo, the Nazis knock on your door, you answer it, they say, are you hiding a Jewish family? Well, if you're going to tell the truth, the answer is obvious, but that would be wrong. So there are some cases when the consequences, real harm for other people, outweigh what looks like a binding ethical principle. That's a clear example, I think. There are ones that are gray, and then you just have to make your own decision. But they're also the everyday example. Let's put aside these wartime examples that I've been sort of referring to. You know, your friend has got a new piece of clothing, a shirt, a blouse, a tie, whatever it is. And your first reaction as they walk up to you wearing it is, oh my God, where did that come from? And they say, but as they get closer, you can tell they want to know what you think. And they're really proud of it. And so what do you think of what I'm wearing? Now, you could say that that's really one of the worst things I've ever seen. And, you know, how could you wear that in public? But no, you say, you know, you say something different, you know, wow, that's really remarkable. Boy, you must really like that a lot. And if they say, well, do you really like it? Oh yeah, I think that looks really, you might say, I think it looks really good. So look, there's a Venetian saying, old Venetian saying, the truth, but not to everybody. So you ought to understand what the truth is. You ought to obey the law. You shouldn't commit fraud. You should try not to lie. But you've got to be adept at sort of maneuvering in some of these gray ethical areas. And what you were trying to do are two things. You're trying to minimize whatever ethical violations you would regard as the most serious. And you're trying to make a decision that you can defend up to a point. You can say, yes, I did violate this one company value, but I was trying to pursue some others, and I thought they were dominant in this situation, and this is why. And you need to be able to explain that, but you'll only be able to explain it up to a point. And then at that point, you decided it's turtles all the way down. But if you're going to move into a moral gray area and do something morally dubious, you should do it for moral reasons, and you should be able to justify it as the better of two decisions, the better right or the lesser wrong, and be able to explain it. Beyond that, I'm not sure what more you can do.
And Joe, this is exactly what Krishna would have also said. This is exactly what Krishna would have also said. Now, I think we also need to take a look at the second part. So when you take a look at Achilles, and he was a leader in all terms, all meaning of the term leadership, right? When you talk about leadership. However, he didn't do everything that was right. But then, without him, I'm not so sure whether they would have been able to really win the war. Now, if we were to take a look at the conundrum, the leadership conundrums that Achilles faced, he was trying to resolve all the conundrums based on strength. Probably when he came to Krishna, at that time, he didn't even know that he was vulnerable. He would have probably walked up to Krishna and would have probably said, look, I'm absolutely invincible. I have won the war and I will continue winning the war. And I mean, it's because of my sheer strength, the very fact that no one can kill me. That's what makes me a leader. Now, within the corporate world, probably we also have instances of leaders of a similar kind because of their intellect, because of the manner in which they've been taking it forward. They've been able to prove their mettle. However, their paths could have been dubious. The way in which they approached issues could have been dubious, but that's all history. Today, they're recognized as leaders. Would you say that they are, one, similar to Achilles? Two, if that is the right path to pursue, to go ahead with corporate leadership, to intertwine it with personal leadership at the cost of a whole pile of other things?
Yes, that's a great question. First of all, if you want to be a leader, I think in any sphere of life, even in family life, sometimes you do need to have confidence and strength. Okay. Without that, a lot will not happen. But often people, as you said, have succeeded and succeeded repeatedly and gotten into positions of real power and authority with one of two problems. And you mentioned both of them. One is they may have done some things along the way that they shouldn't have done. They may have broken the law, gotten away with it, been lucky, and they may have done things that were unethical, or may have done both, okay? Or they may get to these positions of leadership thinking, like Achilles, that they are basically invulnerable. And the Achilles story, of course, was when he was born, his mother heard a prophecy that he would die. There are different accounts of when and how he would die. She said, I must protect him. So one account of the myth is she held him as a child, as an infant by his ankle, and dipped him into the river Styx, pulled him out, and believed he was protected. And he was, except for the ankle where he held him. And everyone who gets to a position of leadership has these kinds of vulnerabilities. What's a very intriguing idea, I think, is this notion that if you have been in the flow of success, or believe you have been in the flow of success, you are vulnerable in some ways that other people who have hit bumps in the road, who have made mistakes and known they've made mistakes, who have made mistakes and maybe suffered career penalties for it, who have had tough times in life. These second individuals, these folks who have hit the bumps in the road, often see life and morality as much more complex. I'll give you two quick examples. One is the infamous Harvard Business School graduate, Jeff Skilling, who started Enron, the energy business, which was the biggest corporate bankruptcy of its time. He had a brilliant record as a student. He had a brilliant record as a McKinsey consultant. He was a brilliant innovator at Enron with a high-tech, at the time, a high-tech platform for trading gas futures. He thought he was invulnerable, extended that into a lot of other businesses. They started failing. He started committing fraud. But he had been in this flow of success, never realized his own vulnerabilities. Another example that may come closer to home for the audience, as well as for those of us at Harvard Business School, is Rajat Gupta, who was the managing partner of McKinsey. He made his way from India on a tough road to the US, When he graduated from Harvard Business School, no one wanted to hire him. It's probably bias against him as an Indian. A professor helped him get a job at McKinsey. He was brilliant. He became managing partner. He retired. He unfortunately fell in with a guy named Raj Rajaratnam, a very successful but corrupt hedge fund trader who traded heavily on inside information. And to go back to classic literature in the West, one of Shakespeare's most famous plays is Othello. Othello was a brilliant warrior, seemingly invulnerable. His loyal number two was Iago, who turned on Othello after Othello did not appoint Iago to a position that Iago thought he deserved. And just like Iago brought about Othello's downfall, Raj Rajaratnam corrupted Rajat Gupta. And Gupta walked out of a couple of Goldman Sachs board meetings, picked up the telephone immediately, called Rajaratnam and passed along inside information, not knowing that the US government was taping these conversations. So this flow of success can be dangerous if you think you are invulnerable. Now, we did a study at Harvard Business School of MBAs, and our MBAs come from all around the world. And we found that they fell into roughly two categories. There was one group who had been successful, had great resumes, great high school records, great records in grade school. They picked the right family so they'd have the right genetic endowment. They just got everything right, okay? And then there was a second group of people who felt like they were outsiders, had faced challenges, minority students, military students, women, international students. And this second group of students had been introduced to complexity, partly because they were sort of outsiders trying to get in and saw the world in a more complicated way. And so I think there is a big advantage to people who are not like Achilles, who are aware of their vulnerabilities, often because realistically they have failed, and then learn from those failures. Final quick comment. There's two kinds of failures. There's what are called type A failures from which you never recover. That's walking in front of the bus going 60 miles an hour. That's going to prison for 17 years like Jeff Skilling did, okay? And then there's type B failures. And these aren't so bad. They're painful. They can be setbacks. They're not the line you want on your resume, but maybe they get you to think differently about the world and about yourself and see some of the complexity out there and prepare you to navigate it better for yourself and for other people down the road. You know, a lot of people who have been fired once, not fired for fraud or criminal behavior, they're just, something happened, organizational politics, a change of direction. That's a tough experience. And some of those people have learned a lot from it. And I think we're on a different and better trajectory as a result of that difficult experience. So I'd say beware the flow of success.
Okay, so one last question, Joe, from us, and then we'll take some audience questions. So what are, given all these complexities and the vulnerability, and when Achilles speaks to Krishna and he meets Krishna as thinking that he is invincible, he's not, he does not have any vulnerabilities. As someone who is seeing this leader, and what would the lesson be? How should leaders be effective, still be effective, but also be mindful of their vulnerabilities? So what would your advice be to leaders at all levels, and leadership is something that exists at all levels. So what would those lessons be?
Well, I'll pass along a couple minor lessons briefly and then a major one. The minor one is look at the other people in your organization. Look at the mistakes they're making, look at their vulnerabilities, look at risks they're taking that you think are excessive risks, and don't think you are different from them, okay? See the other people in your organization as a mirror in which you can see aspects of yourself. That's the minor one that I would put in front of you. The major one, and this is hard to do, but it's so valuable to have a friend at work who knows you and can have honest conversations with you about what you're doing well and where you may be mistaken in your thinking. And I know people who have been on both sides of this kind of relationship in organizations. And if you're the beneficiary, if you've got somebody who knows the organization and knows you, and you can go to them and say, this is what I'm thinking of doing, or what do you think about what I said at the meeting? And you have these conversations not once, but over a period of time, you can learn about yourself, I think, much more effectively from someone else who is a close and supportive observer than you can in almost any other way. And I think no one has done this study, but I think that if you looked at boards of directors, a lot of CEOs, at least in the US, and I've heard some of them say this off the record, they don't like board of directors meetings. Now, a couple days out of their schedule, 5-6 times a year, lots of detailed preparation, a zillion PowerPoint slides, lots of compliance checklists, and a lot of conversations that are all sort of prepared and scripted. But I think that good boards and good CEOs have an inner circle. And this is a small number of people. And when somebody in this small circle who's a board member thinks the CEO has made a mistake or is making the mistake, they will say so diplomatically, with some evidence, in confidence. Be careful about doing this, or maybe don't do it again. And it's these small circles, these close relationships of people who know the organization and know you and have seen you over time, where I think you can get a better sense of what you're good at and where you're vulnerable and where you've made mistakes and demonstrated that sort of vulnerability. But these relationships take time to develop, but I think they're really valuable.
Okay, so there's an interesting question on one of your books, Joe, which is Step Back, Bringing the Art of Reflection into Your Busy Life, where you talk about mosaic reflection.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit more about what this reflection is and how can you...
Sure. I smiled because this is the last book that I published. And the focus was something I've said to people quite often over the years, which is, you should spend more time reflecting. And I think I suspect that almost everybody listening has been told this and may have given other people this advice. But the problem is nobody ever continues and says, this is what reflection is. This is how you do it. And this is how you find time to do it nowadays. So I interviewed about 100 people, managers at all levels, some of them CEOs, former CEOs of big companies, everyone listening would recognize, some entry-level people, folks in between. And I asked them, we talked about reflection. The funny thing was, a lot of them, when they came to the interview, a lot of them were people in executive programs at HBS. And so I'd interview them while they were on campus. They'd say, I'd be glad to help out, but I'm really the wrong person because I don't reflect. And I said, well, let's talk about that a little bit. And what they meant was that they didn't do classic reflection, which I came to call go to the mountain reflection, which is lengthy, solitary, tranquil, religious, somewhat spiritual, regular. They just didn't have time to do that. And they concluded they didn't reflect. And I said, well, that's okay. I understand that, but thank you for coming. Let's talk a little more. And what I did in about half the interviews was I continued the initial discussion. And then about a week later, I'd send them an email and say, did you do anything in the last couple hours, last day, that might look like reflection? And then we met again and talked about reflection. And what I discovered was that virtually everyone was reflecting, but in little bits and pieces of time, in sort of the cracks and crevices of their life. And it's what I came to call mosaic reflection. And I meant mosaic in two ways. First of all, it's little bits of time. It's not going to the mountain. And secondly, each person had put together their own little pattern of moments, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, that counted as reflection for them. In many cases, for example, reflection was not solitary, but involved a kind of reflective conversation with someone else in the organization. The kind of conversation I was talking about just a few moments ago. Some people talked about reflecting on their commute. Some people talked about reflecting while they did exercise. There was the proverbial reflection while you take a shower. One woman who was an engineering background said when she had a hard problem, she made spreadsheets. One CEO of a very big company said when he had a hard problem, he would close his office door, put on headphones, listen to his favorite songs from Broadway musicals really loud. He wanted to sort of clear his mind. Everybody had found their own little patterns of ways to reflect. So that's why I called it mosaic reflection. You come back to the same problem again and again. And I think this also reflects the way most of our minds work. We like to think that we have this powerful spotlight intelligence, this analytical intelligence, and we can focus it on an issue. This is go to the mountain and really make progress. And some people can do this, and we should all try to do it occasionally. Step back for half an hour, think about life, think about work. But if you think about how we evolved as creatures and the pre-human creatures, we had to be perpetually hyper-vigilant. Would some creature come out of the forest or the savannah and attack us? Was there an insect crawling on us or our offspring? Did we have enough food? Things hyper-vigilant in a dangerous world. And the creatures that survived and became us, arguably, are the ones that had this sort of hyper-vigilance. In the Buddhist tradition, this is referred to as the monkey mind. And I find that a wonderful phrase because by referring to monkeys, it points to pre-human evolution, but it points to the fact that monkeys are always moving around. And so we should not expect our minds to do, except for some unusual individuals, to be able to pause and really do things in this classic form of reflection. Our minds are going to move around, and we have to know our own minds. We have to observe ourselves, look for the times and places where we get these little fragments of insight, and try to repeat those times and places more often and create a mosaic or pattern of reflection that works for ourselves. So that's a summary of the book. Maybe it didn't require book length treatment, but the book is out there.
Okay, so there's an interesting question by Prashant, and he says, leaders end up having their favorites at workplace based on personal chemistry, synergy, scarce availability of talent, or other reasons. But actions like these could also become a source of dissonance for those who are not on that list, and which we typically understand as the in-group, out-group problem in leadership. Uh, uh, how how do you see this game or these actions in the spirit of leadership conundrum and vulnerabilities?
Well, first of all, the phenomenon is almost universal. It's probably another aspect of behavior that has its roots in evolution. You know, we survived not as individuals looking out for our self-interest. We survived in groups, and we want to be part of a group of people who not just sort of think like us, but see the world like us and have the same instincts. And the pre-human groups that were bonded like that kept food, they created defenses, they survived and became us. The isolated individuals died out. They couldn't pass along their genes. So it is, as Nietzsche said, human all too human. You see it in every organization. And within limits, it's valuable. The world is a tough and complicated place. And if you want to get things done that make sense strategically, competitively, practically, you need a like-minded core of people who, once a decision is made, are going to all be rowing in the same direction. However, I think every top management team, and this can be the top at a department, it can be the top at a global company, needs to have one or two irritating members. And these are people who are not sort of instinctively or politically on the same page as the boss, and will say what they think, will strike a discordant note. And some organizations, I understand, I've never talked to anybody firsthand, will actually have somebody play the devil's advocate if there is no one like that and a final decision has to be made. And that individual's mandate will be to make the strongest possible case against whatever has been proposed and whatever has a consensus surrounding it. So you need to have or create the dissident voices, and you need to reward those dissident voices, okay? Thank you for raising that question. I hadn't thought about it. That's a tough question. We need to struggle with it so that people are rewarded for bringing those things together. And the final thing I'd add is, as a leader, you ought to try to set an example, which means occasionally, not too often, but occasionally asking, quote, dumb questions, okay? If you really don't understand something, and in the world today, there's so much technically complex stuff that you're not going to understand, ask the dumb question. That empowers other people to ask, quote, dumb questions. And those questions can often be valuable perspectives that have been left out by groupthink. But you got to do something like that. You need the sort of little bit of sand in the oyster that's, you know, might develop into a little bit of a pearl, and a pearl worth paying some attention to.
This is a very interesting question, Joe, if I may, which has come, and I'll try linking it to the topic as well. So someone talks about manipulation. This is a very interesting question, which talks about manipulation. So I think I understand where the person's coming from. So it's both Krishna, who did manipulation. He talked about manipulation, and Achilles as well. So if there was a coffee conversation between the two, and I would say both of them would say, hey, manipulation is a leadership trait. You need to manipulate the people all around you to be able to achieve what it is that you want. So, Joe, what are your views on that? Because leaders do manipulate. It's not that they don't manipulate.
Well,
is that right? Is that not right? Ethically, it's wrong. morally it's wrong.
I prefer the word orchestration. I wouldn't want to try to draw a sharp boundary between the two. And there may well be some cases where something that looks like manipulation is what you've got to do. I'm concerned about manipulation, however, because if you're in a half-decent organization, and I hope the people listening are, the people around you are intelligent. They observe. If you're the leader, they're watching you all the time. They want to get ahead. They want to see what you're thinking. And you may think you are cleverly manipulating, that you're a clever puppeteer. It's a good chance they're observing it, which means that when you try to say something authentic, in the future, they'll wonder, well, is this another bit of propaganda? Am I getting manipulated? And as I said a moment ago, they may think that's how you get things done here. And they'll start doing it. And that's a dangerous sort of practice in an organization. So I would stay away from manipulation. We'd have to kind of define what that is. Orchestration is different. I mean, think of a classic Western symphony orchestra. You've got 100 people, lots of different instruments. Maybe think of it in terms of jazz, which is improvisation, a smaller number of people with different instruments. And who plays what and how long they play and how loud they play, all has to come together to orchestrate, to support the strategy we have, the direction we want to move in a way that is coherent and engaging. And that kind of orchestration that says, we're going to put this person here, we're going to say this there, we're going to emphasize this here. I think that's good management. But once again, there's some lines you don't want to cross. There's legal lines around fraud. And I think just telling a direct lie is typically wrong, and don't think you're an adept actor who can get away with it. So err on the side of orchestration, manipulate as little as possible would be my advice. Look at my background, coming from an academic setting. So that's about the best I can do.
Thank you, Joe.
Joe, I have a related question to this. We also talk about the issue of power and politics in organizations, the use of power, the use of politics, and there is research which says East looks at politics very differently from the West. So East always looks at or countries that are from developing world, they typically have a negative sense of politics and it is bad, whereas the developed world looks at it as an essential component of societies and organizations. So when you talk about orchestration, can you also help us understand a little better about the right use of power and politics to drive orchestration, and when that use of power politics could actually be manipulative and wrong? So is there some sense there that you can help us understand?
Sure. I'll answer your last question first. I think you're in dangerous territory and maybe just doing something simply wrong if your politics or your manipulation is basically aimed at serving your interest, the interests of you and your pals who happen to be running an organization, and not the broader interest of the institution, the organization, and to some extent, the society around you. So it really comes back to your motives and your aims. And you can get away with self-serving behavior for a long time. I suspect most people listening know some people that they suspect of. Now, if you have luck, good mentors, you can do that for a long time. I would not recommend it. And it's hazardous because some people will either replicate it, as I said, which is bad for the organization, or they'll play the same game as you and they'll play it better and they'll bring you down. I would dissent from the research, Vishal, that says that there are differences between East and West. I'll exaggerate my dissent for the purpose of provoking thought. The discovery of management, you can trace it back to the Romans, or you can trace it to the rise of big businesses 100, 200 years ago. But the idea that you could have a hierarchy and a boss and then sub-bosses and get data and allocate responsibilities and measure and have a strategy. This was just a brilliant innovation, okay? And so I think hierarchy in one form or another is inevitable unless we want to live in sort of small hunter-gatherer groups. And I think if you look at those, you would also find hierarchy. Because when there was an attack or a danger or a dangerous predator, somebody had to say, we'll do this, we'll do that, and everyone had to mobilize it quickly. So in almost any organization, there are some folks with more power than others. Typically, the ones that have more power get better pay, more respect, more prestige inside the organization. And there is a power game to move up to the top. Okay, I think this is just a fundamental dimension of human nature and good management everywhere. So how do you think about politics? If you're leading an organization, you want to be responsible and you want to get things done. One of the fascinating case studies that we use in this literature course is actually not literature, it's nonfiction. But it's a classic study of Abraham Lincoln. And as almost everyone knows, Abraham Lincoln is known as the great emancipator. He freed the slaves. And he's a heroic figure that kept the United States from fragmenting into two, or who knows how many separate countries it would have fragmented into if Lincoln leading the North had not won the Civil War. So he's a great leader. However, a close look at Lincoln reveals that he was an extraordinarily adept political observer and maneuverer, okay? And I won't go into details on this, but he had an instinct for the political terrain wherever he found himself. Who was powerful? What did they want? How powerfully, how aggressively were they likely to use their power? Can I create an alliance with them? Can I maneuver around them? Can I weaken them? This is a kind of orchestration based on reading the political landscape very astutely. And Lincoln would be unknown. He'd be an unknown legislator from the state of Illinois if he had not had this extraordinary ability, this extraordinary second sense. You know, the vehicle of the future is an electronic vehicle. And I think Tesla is just about to come to India. And I'm sure there'll be Indian companies creating EVs. What's unusual about EVs is that they are surrounded by sensors and cameras and radar, and they are constantly tracking the environment around them. And I think successful leaders do that as a really important instinct, not their only instinct. It's necessary, but not sufficient for leadership, but to really track the political terrain and to see what's possible and what isn't and where to maneuver. At the end of the day, there can be too much politics. You have to fight politicians. You don't want a lot of politicians in an organization, but given hierarchy and given the fact that all the good stuff is at the top, politics is inevitable. It's the kind of creatures we are.
Thank you so much, Joe. Now that you're coming to a close of this seminar, so Vishal, there are just a couple of points that I would like to add on, if I may.
Yeah, please.
So it's very interesting. You've been talking a lot about the leadership conundrum, the complexities that are there, the complexities that are faced by leaders, and how do they traverse through those complexities. However, there is one point that I would like to make before I hand the floor over to you and to Vishal. You know, there are certain learnings that we need to imbibe both from the West as well as East, where leadership is concerned. From the West, I know we could have picked up any one of the characters, but the reason as to why we picked up Achilles is because of the very, very positional leadership, the macho image that he brings to the fore, the invincibility of this person. Leaders, when they move to that position, it may not be a warlike position, but what is important is that when they move to that position, they think they're absolutely invincible. Now, that is a very masculine, going by Bem's scale, that's a very masculine approach to leadership. But when we try to merge this, so that's a key learning for us, that there has to be confidence, you did talk about it. There has to be the strength for endurance, you talked about it. But together with that, there is something which is more intrinsic, which I think Krishna would bring to the fore. Krishna would say, forget about the focus on the results. Achilles is only bothered about winning the war. Forget about the focus of winning the war. What is the process that you follow to be able to achieve that final victory towards which you are moving? If your processes are right, you would be victorious. There's nothing, no one that can stop you. So there is the outside and there is the inside. And probably it's very interesting, if you were to take a look at this, Krishna's philosophy, it merges very well with what Socrates said. The unexamined life is not worth living. Krishna explicitly or implicitly, and that's a point you also made, gets you to reflect on what you have done, what you are doing, and what you will be doing. If you're convinced with what you're doing, then all lies, all manipulations are acceptable. The consequences could be dire. Even Krishna, this is for your information, Joe, he's also killed. He's cursed and he's killed with a poisonous arrow that is shot in his heel, the same fate as Achilles. So at the end of the day, all these philosophies, all concepts of leadership merge into the larger concept called the universe, and what the universe has to teach each one of us. So those were my observations and those were my comments. So over to you, Joe, and over to you, Vishal.
I'd be curious to hear from Vishal, and then I'd like to make some comments replying to you, Asha, and to you, Vishal.
Joe, go ahead, please.
Oh, sure. Okay.
Yeah.
So, Asha, you touched on two things that I agree with very strongly, and I'm glad you raised them. One is this issue of gender and toughness. My sense from the successful women leaders I've known, and I've known some pretty well, is that they're tough. If anything, they have to be even tougher because they've had to move up an even steeper hill because of their gender. But stylistically, they're often different. And I think stylistically, and not just stylistically, but intellectually and viscerally, they see and sense the world as a more complicated place. And I think they are better at moving through difficult terrains, sensing what's going on. There's lots of drawbacks to being an outsider and to being marginalized by society, okay? I don't want to romanticize it. But often people who have started out at the margins are much better observers of the insiders than the insiders themselves, because the insiders think they understand the world. It will always be the same. They will be at the center of it. They know how things work, and everybody's really kind of like them. So I think it does take toughness across genders, but I think if I'm going to generalize, and I don't like doing it, women may see a little bit more of the complexity and in a valuable way. Secondly, Asha, you mentioned process, and I think that is so important. You know, in these gray area decisions, you never know whether you've made the right decision or not. You decide, okay, but you're fallible. You may have had the wrong information, okay? You may have had a bad day. You may have tried to work it through with smart people in your organization. They may have made a mistake or looked at the wrong data. Who knows? Okay. The only thing you can control is the process. Did you try to make the decision in the right way with other people when you're working through the decision? And then when you're reflecting before you decide for yourself, did you really pause and think about, as I put it before, what really matters in the situation that you can live with? What's moral as you're defining it in the situation that you can live with, and what you think will work. And then you go ahead, you explain, you persuade, and you try to execute as best you can. Will you get it right? No. If there was a clear right answer, it wouldn't be gray, and you wouldn't have spent all the time struggling with it. The only thing you can really control is the process. The best you can do is deserve to get it right. No guarantee you will get it right. Last thing I'd like to put in front of everybody comes back to Krishna, Achilles, the lessons from classic literature. And I define literature from the perspective, I define leadership from the perspective of classic literature in a single sentence. It's a long sentence. I'll explain it as I go along. But if you look closely at works of literature that have endured and that speak to us, you'll see that leadership is a struggle, okay? Leaders almost never have it easy. I explained earlier why it's a struggle. The problems are hard, morality is complex, execution is tough. It's a struggle by a flawed human being. We have our vulnerabilities, our vulnerable heels. And that's partly why we need people close to us who can help us see where those vulnerabilities are and recalibrate and readjust. A struggle by a flawed human being to make some human values. The key word is some. You have to choose in these gray area, right versus right dilemmas and conundrums. You have to say, yes, we're accountable in a lot of directions. Yes, we have a lot of responsibilities. This is the priority. This comes first. As I see it, this is what we're going to do. So some human values, a struggle by a flawed human being to make some human values real and effective. If the world isn't different, if what you decide isn't translated into something that's real and effective, it's not leadership. It may be well-intentioned, it may be inspirational, it's not leadership. Some human values, real and effective in the world as it is. And that's what Asha and Vishal and I have been trying to put in front of everybody. The world as it is, a lot of uncertainty, the world with politics, the world with vulnerable people. So it's a struggle by a flawed human being to make some important human values real and effective in the world as it is. It's not the only definition, but that's the one that I think comes out of really valuable literature, either the old books that we occasionally read and learn from, and contemporary books that somehow get under our skin and make us think a little bit, make us pause a little bit, make us hesitate a little bit about who we are and what we're aiming for. So I'll close there. I'm curious to hear what you have to say, Vishal.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. It's a very, very powerful sentence that you have given us in terms of how you look at leadership and struggle by a flawed human being to make some human values real and effective in the world as it is. I think it beautifully summarizes things that we have been discussing in the conversation. Just one last closing comment or question, if I may. There is also a difference, and this is also a question from the audience. Uh, for leaders, there are many a times stated values and also practiced values. And there is, so I say, there is something that has been stated, but practice, and that is kind of a problematic thing as well. What has been your experience around values and how people look at these? How do you identify those perhaps the right values? Is there something that you would want to tell us more on the values bit?
Yes, I would say at the end of the day, trust yourself and trust your instincts. If you get off the merry-go-round of life and work momentarily, or you're sort of pulled off of it, or it seems to stop because you hear something and you feel something and it says, this is important, this is right, this is valuable, or this is important, this is wrong, this is not who we are, this is who I am. Trust yourself, stop and reflect on that. If you find it something that's really valuable to you and you feel instinctively is right for the organization, try to find a way to orchestrate, to clarify, to persuade, to make it real and effective. If it's something that you are uncomfortable with, try to find a way to avoid it, to minimize it, to bring it to the attention of people who can deal with it. And at some points, these are very rare. Sometimes there's just lines that you don't want to cross. And you may have to move on. You may have to say something and run the risk of losing your job. You can only do that maybe once or twice in a career. The really successful people are the people who say, this is right, and they find a way to pursue it. And this makes me uncomfortable, and they find a way to reduce it, to minimize it, to undermine it. So they live to fight another day. And, and what you learn from doing something like that is how to master complexity, how to understand complexity and navigate complexity. And in a good organization, you'll get a reward for that, which is more complexity to manage. And with hard work and some luck and the right skills, you'll do well at that and you continue to move up. But minimize the bad stuff and try to really pursue the good stuff as you see it, as it resonates with you, as it brings out your deeper convictions and your sense of who you are. Do that as effectively as you can, and you won't be on a bad path. Coming back to what Asha said, that's a pretty good process for thinking about what you're going to do and thinking about what you really should be doing.
Thank you, Joe, for all these pearls of wisdom. It really demonstrates the thinking and the research that has gone behind all these thoughts that you have shared. And really, what I could gather is our lives are complex. Accountabilities, moralities, these are complex problems. Implementation of the decisions are challenging as well. So for leaders, it will always be a dirty hand problem. Dirty hands problem. We've got to choose between right versus right, and what is less wrong. And there it is important for us to believe and decide, reflect and decide, and trust the process, as Joe mentions, that you have to reflect. You have to have people around who could help you, remind you of your vulnerabilities as well, maybe help you discuss some of the things that you are planning to do. And then keeping all this in mind, you have to decide what are those important values that you would like to uphold for the organization, for yourself, as well as the organization, and we are all flawed. There will be vulnerabilities. We may go wrong at times, but that would be type B failures. As Joe says, it would not be a type A failure. You can still get up, learn from it, and hope things would be better the next time. Thank you, Joe. It has been wonderful listening to you, interacting with you. Thank you for accepting our invitation to be a part of this conversation. Thank you, everybody, as well, for joining us and for raising and for asking very, very interesting questions.
Thanks, Joe, for being here with us.
I enjoyed it very much. Best
Thank you
wishes
so
to
much.
everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you, and good night and good day ahead for people around the world. Thank you.